In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Jesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Jesus is King. Welcome to the 1 Peter 5 podcast, Rebuilding Christendom, Restoring Catholic Culture and Tradition. And I'm very happy to be joined by my good friend, Luis Medina. Luis, how you doing, brother?
Hey, Timothy, good morning from Texas. Glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, Hispanidad, but not as much of a favorite as Luis Medina, who is the founder and runner of the ministry Reconquista, which is Spanish language. So if you speak Spanish, this is a perfect place to go. Tell us what's going on lately. What's new with Reconquista?
Oh my goodness, lots of things going on. We have different guests talking about health, spiritual health, mental health, politics. Usually Reconquista started story with a political angle because I focus on U.S. policy, explain it to the Spanish-speaking world, you know, what U.S. policy means for their countries, right? Like especially with commodities or whatever, things like that. And it kind of evolved and grew like that. And it's still at the heart of in politics, you know, because I started in radio doing political coverage, went to the White House, you know, all that kind of stuff. And now there's a lot of more like an integrative type of podcast, and I'm very happy. So I have different interviews. This Thursday, I'm going to have in Spanish a economist and historian, Ariel Umpierrez, who's going to talk about inflation, you know, explain especially concerning the U.S. and Latin America. So that's where we have in this week in Reconquista Network.
Fantastic. And so should people just go to the YouTube URL? Is that the best place to start here?
That's the one. Yeah, it's as you see it, Reconquista Network. Reconquista name it after the Reconquest, inspiring the Reconquest of Spain. And the aim is for reconquering our media, you know, bringing back good content. The aim of Reconquista is not just bring quality content, which I have, obviously. I'm not the only one who does that, but it's actually doing more like relevant content, things that you can actually employ in your daily life, your daily struggles, whether you're an entrepreneur, cleric, doesn't matter, mom, homeschooling, you name it. So that's kind of the aim of the channel. It's not necessarily more like focus on revisionist history or whatever point, which we touch history and all that, but really it's more aim as practical knowledge. And we're very glad that, you know, so it's been an awesome journey.
Fantastic. Thanks be to God. You're doing great work, Luis. So check it out. Spanish language, Reconquista. So I wanted to start with, oh, you know what? Actually, before we start there into our topic, let me just say, welcome to the 11th week after Pentecost. Once again, we're promoting this calendar because it is critical for rebuilding Christendom in your family. Is this beautiful calendar, liturgyofthehome.com. You can get it at this website, liturgyofthehome.com. So it's the 11th Sunday after Pentecost. Today is the feast of the Immaculate Heart of the Blessed Virgin Mary. This feast obviously is intimately connected with Our Lady of Fatima, intimately connected with the modern period, and as we'll talk in just a moment, intimately connected with Hispanidad through Our Lady of Guadalupe, the two different Guadalupes. So this week we have St. Philip Benizi, the Apostle, St. Bartholomew. We have St. Louis the Ninth, and this is really big as well because in the city of St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States, they're having a great celebration of Christendom and the great St. Louis in response to the Summer of Love Marxist attempts at takeover of our states and the cities in the United States when, you know, the BLM was about burning and destroying poor people's businesses in the inner city. So they have this beautiful response to this because they try to tear down the statue of St. Louis in St. Louis. And in response to this, they have this beautiful procession and celebration of St. Louis. And he is a great crusader king. He is a wonderful lay saint. He's a layman, obviously, layman of Christendom. There's a fantastic book, in fact. Let me just recommend this real quick because this is so important. This is called Before Church and State. And we'll talk about this today with Hispanidad, but this is French Christendom, obviously. And this is what our French forefathers built in Canada and the Midwest, which we'll talk about in a few weeks with Charles Colomb and Kennedy Hall. And St. Louis helped to build this. And that was before church and state, before there was this strong distinction, obviously. Even in the church today, we have that problem because the church itself is defined as the clergy instead of the clergy and the laity. So big feast day coming up this week. So, and then before we get into our topic, we do need to remind everyone that this is a free program, but it's not free to produce. We do have costs. We got bills to pay. We are a nonprofit, so we do ask for your support. We need monthly contributors in particular. So go to 1peter5.com/donate. So first, let's start with Our Lady. I think that Our Lady is really the soul of Hispanidad. I put so the thumbnail. If viewers aren't familiar with this thumbnail, the thumbnail is Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, Extremadura, which is in Spain. And then we have, obviously, we prayed the Ave Maria before the icon of Our Lady of Guadalupe, Empress of the Americas. So there's two different Guadalupes, two different Our Lady of Guadalupe. So tell us about Our Lady and her relation to Hispanidad, Luis.
Well, Our Lady in our relation to Hispanidad is always very, very deep. Actually, that's the key characteristic of the Hispanic Catholicism, if I can put it that way. And we'll define Hispanic or Hispanicity, whatever you want to call it, a little later on. On a side note, very quickly, the St. Louis King of France, one of my favorite kings. And I say this because Spain has had St. Ferdinand, which is a great king. Not Ferdinand, the spouse of Queen Isabella. Ferdinand the king, the father of Alphonsus the Wise. So we have great monarchs, but St. Louis, by all means. The ironic thing is I'm known for Hispanidad, but I'm named after him. Luis is my middle name. Jose is my first one. So I'm named after the French king. And I've been to the Basilica in St. Louis, Missouri, too. I have to, right? So I'm a great admirer of St. Louis. And I wish, we can have leaders and politicians that emulate his behavior. But anyway, back to Our Lady Guadalupe. So that's the name of the Guadalupe River. Remember in Spain, long story short is when the Moors conquered Spain, or started conquering Spain, most of it. Islam, by the way, is still, till this day, very salty against Spain. And there's a reason why. Because Spain is the only place where Islam has not just lost, but lost badly. Everywhere else that Islam has set foot, they have set shop and they stay there forever till this day. All those lands used to be Christian, Orthodox, or Western Christian, you name it. They have stayed there all the way to Asia, except for Spain. And this is why one of the extreme wings of Islam till this day, they claim, usually when they're going to reconquer, they're also going to start with Spain. They haven't forgotten about that. They're Reconquista. It's the only place. Other than that, and this is why it's so dreadful as Islam advances in Europe again. But anyway, on the side note, so the Moors started advancing. There's this little statue that St. Luke, the same writer of the Gospel of St. Luke carved, and it's an image of Our Lady. Obviously, it hasn't darkened because of time, wear and tear, and is known as our brown or darkened Lady, La Morena, okay, in Spanish. So, as the Moors were advanced, this image was taken up north and it was buried, because they didn't want the Moors to commit sacrilege and just, desecrate the image of Our Lady. Well, that was in the year 700. Like the 14th century, a farmer, a rural person was looking for their animals. A shepherd was looking for their animals, and he just found the image by accident. It is very funny how we find this theme of Our Lady appearing randomly in Spanish society. Remember the battle of, I forgot the name right now, against the Dutch right now. It's very important. The Miracle of Empel. The Miracle of Empel in the Netherlands. They dug an image of Our Lady, an icon of Our Lady with the blue mantle, which is very distinctive for Our Lady in Spain, by the way, that color. So anyway.
That was the Army of Flanders.
That was Flanders, yeah.
The Hispanic Army of Flanders. Sorry, we'll get back to that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, one of those reoccurring themes, Our Lady appears, and It heals people. Villages, commemorate it. They become basically, long story short, it turns into a pilgrimage, like a shrine, and till this day, it's one of the most visited. Our Lady of Guadalupe, when our peer says, she was speaking actually Nahuatl, which is the indigenous tongue of the descendants of the Aztecs and a lot of the Mesoamerican tribes. And that's why when they're trying to translate it, the name that she gave her the title was the Guadalupe, and there was that connection there. It's like, oh, this is incredible. I mean, this is a reassurance of what's going on in Spain centuries before with Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico. The difference is that Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico, or what is now Mexico, because technically it was still Spain, has become, I think, it's the second most visited shrine in the world, or something, just right after Vatican City. I'm not sure. Like, it's just it's an international phenomenon that literally belongs to everyone, and it's like a confirmation of what Our Lady was doing in the whole New World, not just what is now known as Mexico. This is one of the reasons why, by the way, Timothy, I object and fight the idea that Our Lady of Guadalupe is a Mexican phenomenon, because A, first of all, there was no such thing as Mexico back then. It was a Spanish phenomenon. And B, it was not even intended to be a nationalistic symbol anyway. That goes against the grain of being Hispanic. We don't have nationalistic tones. If you see that, it's clearly being imported by different ideologies. But anyway, that's the short version of our story of Our Lady Guadalupe and her presence in Spain. Why is Our Lady so present in Spain? I don't know, and it might be with St. James, who might have something to do with it. We know the story of St. James in Spain. Our Lady, if I'm not mistaken, ended up in France. And but we don't know. There's like different debated versions. France clearly has a strong mayor, and I forget the word, veneration, but what distinguishes Hispanic and Hispanicity is a very central, not just a strong, central role that Our Lady plays in our society. It's just a given. It was a shocker to me, Timothy, to learn that different Catholics don't have a strong Marian devotion that I grew up with. That's just the way it is.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, you grew up in Mexico, and you just found out that some Catholics don't have a strong Marian devotion.
I thought it's universal, honestly. I mean, and then I learned some German Catholics or Polish Catholics, and obviously it's not that they don't care about Our Lady. Clearly they care. We're Catholics, right? That's just a given. But it did not really play a central role in that sense. Whereas for us, it's almost like she literally designed our society as it is nowadays. It's a very maternal image of her here for us.
Yeah, I remember when Real Madrid won the European Championship, they immediately they went back to Spain and they brought their trophy cup to Our Lady.
Yeah, it is a very cultural, and this is talking about soccer club, the biggest soccer club in the world in history too. My favorite soccer club, by the way. And it has something to do with a secular world, a cultural thing, and it's still like, oh, hold on, we gotta give praise to Our Lady. And Real Madrid is a very diverse team, by the way. It's not just a bunch of Spanish Catholics there. You have people from all over the world. Think of it like I'm a Boston Red Sox fan, but I gotta admit, the Yankees are the Yankees, right? That's as high as it gets in baseball. Well, it's kind of like the same thing with Real Madrid. They're like the equivalent of the Yankees in the soccer world, and you're gonna get the best of the best from all corners of the world. And people just embrace it. It's such strong association with Catholicism that till this day, despite the Spanish government, the current Spanish government, who is trying so hard to rid Spain of its Catholic heritage, it's still, just standing strong.
So can you define what is Hispanidad? Can you just get into that?
Hispanidad, you can just summarize it very simple. It's the idea, the Catholic idea of a society. Let me give you an example. So most societies center their identity on language, race, some sort of cultural heritage, or prosperity, or some sort of something, fill in the blank. Hispanidad is not anchored on that. It's anchored in Catholicism. And so in other words, is to be Catholic, to be Hispanic is to be Catholic. Okay, which is different from being national Catholic. It's not imposing Catholicism on anything that you find. It's just the lenses that we look life through is going to be the lenses of Catholicism. And this is what makes a difference now, that language doesn't matter to us as much, because there are Hispanics that speak Italian, Catalonian, Basque, indigenous tongues, Spanish, which happens to be the strongest and most popular one. It was actually the Franciscans, Spanish Franciscans, who recorded the indigenous tongues and actually codified it. Otherwise, the indigenous people, the Nahuatl descendants of the Aztecs, would have lost their tongues. It was, which is ironic with these indigenous movements, because in a Hispanic worldview, that does not represent, a different language does not represent a threat to our identity, which is to be Catholic. The threat for us is when we exchange this value of Catholicity or being Catholic for something else, fill in the blank. That's what it is. So the state and the church actually cooperate. I don't want to say like they work together because they have different functions and all that, but they actually cooperate. They're not antagonistic in that Hispanidad worldview. And this is a key element. There's not a competition between the church and state. The state does what the state does, which is administer justice, as St. Paul admonishes. But the church actually is in charge of shaping the culture. And this is a key element. In other words, this is a big issue with Protestant missionaries when they go, especially to Mexico and other places, but particularly Mexico. And I have friends who are Protestants and missionaries, great friends that I admire, friends in Mexico, friends in Spain, actually, who are Baptist missionaries in Spain. And they really have a hard time because they notice that they can hardly evangelize the locals. And we're talking about great numbers. They can do maybe some local churches, they grow a lot, but it cannot take a cultural phenomenon. Because, and they admittedly said this, the moment you cease to be Catholic, you find yourself outside of your own culture. You don't, the feast and the culture doesn't longer make sense in Mexico or any Hispanic country when you detach the Catholic element to it. And they try to replace that with some sort of economic theory or some sort of like industrious or idealism or whatever, which there's nothing wrong with economic, prosperity, but it's just not, it doesn't gel because the society was literally shaped under Catholic lenses. And Our Lady of Guadalupe, like I mentioned before in different podcasts with you, is the prime example of what a Christian society was designed to be for. This is not white, indigenous, or European and American, or whatever it is. It's a Catholic unity.
Well, that's exactly why the enemies of Christ have tried to use Our Lady of Guadalupe as a national symbol instead of as a Catholic symbol, and that's been, that's been their modus operandi throughout the Spanish Empire, because it's all about making a national identity, trying to extract that national identity out of Catholicism.
Yeah,
because it can't really be divorced from Catholicism. It's so intertwined. What about the term Latino? This is what we hear in the United States a lot. People say, I'm a Latino, Latina, whatever. What do you think about the term Latino versus Hispanic?
Well, let's explain very quickly the differences. Latino actually comes from Napoleon III, the grandnephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, when it was the last attempt of France to conquer or have an enclave in the Americas. So when Mexico owed a bunch of money to creditors, meaning Spain, England, France, Spain and England worked out some deal with Mexico. France took as an opportunity to set some claim in the New World because they saw the rise of the United States as a powerhouse, and they want to have some interest, especially with the Monroe Doctrine and all that. Like, there's just American exceptionalism, that they don't want any European interference in this continent. Well, Napoleon III thought, that's when he coined the term Latin American, and that's what it became mainstream ever since, because he was the last, let's say, big international figure to have some interest here in the US. That's when Maximilian came, by the way, to Mexico, and the whole story. Well, and Latin American, in essence, means anybody who comes from a Romance descent or culture. So in other words, technically, Mr. Colón is a Latin American, but nobody thinks of him as a Latin, obviously. But which is France, Portuguese, Spanish, Romanian, Italian. We don't have a lot of Romanian heritage here in America, but anybody who has a Romance connection is a Latin. So technically, Brazilians, even though they speak Portuguese, they don't speak Spanish, they're Latin. But nowadays, at least in America, is used to reference to Spanish, strictly speaking, Spanish descendant people. Hispanics, another word. Hispanics actually are those who descend from Hispania, modern day Spain. Hispania was the name that the Romans gave to that province, by the way. That's where it comes from. And all those who speak the Castilian or Spanish, which is the same thing, language, are Hispanic. Every Hispanic is Latin, but not every Latin is Hispanic, to put it that way. A lot of people get a little bit irked or bothered by the term, like, I'm not Latin, I'm Hispanic. It doesn't really bother me, to be honest, just because, it gets a little more like on a semantic battle that it's just, I'm more concerned about, okay, let's sanctify the culture, right? And if I'm not going to let a term like Latino get on the way. Now, very quickly, with modern mainstream media and their agenda, you've seen, Timothy, and many people probably have seen it too, that the mainstream media, the left, usually tries to appropriate words and they try to remake it, which is a typical classic strategy of Marxists, right? They will redefine language. Well, they use the whole Latin X, which has not gelled, actually has been counterproductive. And all these progressives and liberals here in the US are like baffled, because they're like, why haven't they embraced this thing? And they don't understand the Hispanic culture, essentially, because it's destroying our heritage. But anyway, that in short is the difference between Latino or Latin and Hispanic.
Excellent. Thank you. So let's talk about why at 1 Peter 5, why we are so interested in Hispanidad and Hispanic Christendom. It's because our editorial stance is rebuild Christendom, unite the clans. Spain in particular, perhaps more than any other nation, but arguably other nations did it well too. Like we think of Poland, for example, but Spain, unique among the Catholic nations, has conquered and overcome the three major enemies of Christ in their history. One, you already mentioned, the Saracens, the Mohammedans, the Moors.
Mm-hmm.
The Reconquista took 700 years, but they were finally forced out, 1492. And then, two, the Protestants. The heretics never found any root in Spain. They were, they never really made it in until later, as you said, the Baptists, but still they have such a hard time converting Spaniards and Mexicans. And then three, the communists. And that brings us to the 20th century struggle as well, the Spanish Civil War. So can you comment at all about Spanish Christendom and its unconquered record against these enemies of Christ that have conquered many other nations? You mentioned France. France, one of the most bloody, destructive, the French Revolution. Tell us about more about Spanish Christendom and those three great crowns of victory that it has.
This is, and the reason why we embrace this a lot is for us in America, at least we're speaking, because both Timothy and I have been blessed to live in this country. Spain provides like a blueprint of what's to come and how to overcome it, and it's like, once again, the Spanish just culture and history always helps America. America wouldn't be, literally, this is just common knowledge, and even Biden's admitted it last few months. America wouldn't be America without Spain. That's just the way it is. We think often like France, but actually Spain put the money and a lot of the hard work, especially in the South with the Battle of Pensacola and Mobile and all that. So Spain in the 20th century, again, provides us a great blueprint. It's the only country, just like Islam lost there, it's the only country where Nazism was not be able to take root, but also socialism or communism were not be able to take root. The Marxists actually financed a lot of the intellectual movement in Spain in the early 20th, late 19th century. So before we get to Franco, we got to understand the conditions of what was going on there in Spain. You have a bunch of intellectuals, which obviously to a lot of you nowadays is not a shocker, who really got in this idea, just like Marxist idea, and they started thinking, you know what, we should apply this. And they got in their heads that they got to get rid of the king. Why? Because the king represents a monarch that is authoritarian. He led a general, ruled the country for a little dictatorship, the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera. So they could not forgive that. They just got all these like modern ideas imported from the rest of Europe to Spain. When they were finally able to have their republic and they did all these reforms, this is a key lesson for us because we're living it right this moment, Timothy. One of the first things the Republicans, that's how it was known, the liberals for them back then, was they used codified language, just like we see nowadays. They said, we're going to fund schools. We're going to take care of illiteracy and all that. And they started funding schools. But the thing is, leftists use schools to actually indoctrinate, which is exactly what we see nowadays. One of the greatest factories of indoctrination of this nation is the public school system. it is recorded, not just like theory. We've seen evidence of how those teachers use that to just infiltrate ideology, especially ideology that goes against Christianity. I cannot be more specific because the algorithms, I'm sorry, will censor our channel, and it kind of defeats the point. But you guys understand what I'm trying to say. Well, it's the same back then, and they try to create a chasm or division between church and state. Remember in Hispanidad, they work together or cooperate, even though they're different and they have different interests. And at times they actually even have conflicts, but they still work for the better of society. Everybody knows their role. Well, in this new idea, Marxist idea infiltrated in academic circles, they really saw the need to separate the church, completely make it like secular and divorced from the state in the society. And one of those things they did is, okay, we're going to get rid of school. The church can no longer teach. Kind of the same thing as Mexico and the Cristero stuff. We're going to get rid of the school thing. And they use like ideas like we're going to let women vote. But really underneath that idea, we're slipping a lot of things, and which is the same thing happening in our country, is happening in our country nowadays. In the name of diversity, they're actually trying to just squeeze anything that is Christian or transcendental, for that matter, anyway, out of our society. So they did that. They start doing some reforms and bringing Marxism to society. And the Spanish society were like, okay, we don't like it. We're going to put up with you, until they start attacking the church. They start sacking the churches. They start desecrating cemeteries and persecuting priests and killing them. That's when the Spanish society had enough. And the only trigger event was when they assassinated this political leader from the right. And they realized, okay, if they can go after this political leader, they can go after all of us. And that's when Franco and other conservative generals rose and their civil war started. There's a lot of parallels in our country, modern day, if we see, how can I put it, Timothy? Unprecedented events where certain agencies from our government all of a sudden feel free to raid former political figures in this nation with no accountability, let me put it that way. And a lot of people are wondering, if they did that to former powerful figures in our nation, obviously they can do that to the rest of the population, and we all become targets. Again, Spain is providing the blueprint for us, and we can learn even from their mistakes, by the way. So that's what, in 1936, for 3 years, there was a big civil war. For whatever reason, Timothy, and maybe you or the guys in the chat can explain that to me, I don't understand why every time the left, or the Marxists to be more specific, take hold of power, they feel the need to desecrate religious shrines and temples. It's the only ideology, Timothy, till this day, we see the neo-Marxists and all this global elites and all that, is the only ideology that encourages you to not have children, to forget that it's anything transcendental, that is completely materialistic. Islam is not materialistic, and we obviously disagree with Islam. Judaism the same way, any other religion, they all actually thrive with just have kids, live your life, we have conflicts and all that. This is the only ideology with Marxists that actually is counterproductive and reduces you, actually takes away from you rather than increasing. And it's till this day is baffling to me. I don't understand why it's that way and why people even embrace it. Well, even back then, so they started fighting. And long story short is, you have a division. The cities were taken by the Republicans, the countryside by the nationalists or the conservatives, one of the Franco followers. Franco was one of the most skilled generals in the Spanish army. And essentially, he ended up winning the war and establishes the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. And the rest is history. We can explain more details. I'm just going to pause there to answer any possible questions you may have.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing we can see in this 20th century conflict that parallels what people are facing in the United States already and what they've faced really across Europe and the world with the COVID takeover and the COVID tyranny is the infiltration of leftist politics with Marxist ideas. So in the United States, there was the thing called the Democratic Party back in the days of maybe John F. Kennedy. There was a certain basically, it could be tolerated. You could debatably be a Catholic Democrat at that time.
Yeah.
It just means like more taxes, more stuff, that sort of thing. But now the Democratic Party today in the United States is just a Marxist party. It's just a socialist party at this point. Their platform is entirely pro child murder. It's totally Marxist. Apparently there's pro-life Democrats out there, but they need to take back their party from the Marxists. But in the same way, the Marxists, in the name of republicanism, in the name of just basically liberal ideas, which would be debatable just in terms of, you vote in a president, that idea of voting a president. The Marxists infiltrated that party in Spain in the 20s and 30s, and they instigated the Marxist takeover in the name of democracy. So that's already our parallel in the United States.
And this is one of the things we can actually, in America, we still have plenty of time to pump the brakes. That's for sure. We're not like Spain. In Spain, things radicalized because Spain was obviously there in Europe, geographically speaking. That's an obvious statement. We're not. So the ideas that flew there, they travel a lot faster than they can reach America, even in our modern day, here just, currently what we have. So in Spain, you have a society that's becoming radicalized, right? You see the European theater, you have all these Marxists and you have these fascists. Well, the Spanish society becomes radicalized, two sides. The right-wing side, the fascists, or what they call it, fascists, was led by José Antonio Primo de Rivera, the son of the general who was under the dictatorship. He created a political party, the Falange. And essentially, he united just like traditionalists. He united people who are just plain old right-wingers and fascists and all that. And the Spanish society, especially the youth, saw in that party a refuge, per se, from the persecution that the left wing was doing. Unfortunately, like any war, there's conflicts and there's deaths. War is war, and that's why I'm always troubled with people who advocate for war like so lightly, because once you let the genie out of the bottle, it's just hard to put it back in. Well, even then, with the right wing party and the phalanx and all that, right-wing extremism was very different from the rest of European countries, actually. Unlike fascism with Mussolini or Nazism in Germany, the Spanish right-wings were not actually, they were not just apples, per se. They were not just hunting people and enemies and all that. When Franco wins, the right-wing wins and all that, one of the first things he started doing is trying to look for reconciliation, because Franco understood, Franco was a devout Catholic, Franco understood that we're all brothers and sisters. We can have disagreements and they can be wrong or we can be wrong, but at the end of the day, we're all Spanish, and most importantly, we're all Catholics. So he found in this mountain outside of Madrid area, 40 minutes outside of Madrid, in the Sierra, this mountain range, the perfect place, and he built a basilica. Well, it was a graveyard, and they turned into a monastery and a basilica nowadays. So the idea was, we're gonna bury both sides. Imagine Confederates and Northerners, in one place. And actually, you have a great article by Estefanía Aguirre there. This is a great article, highly recommended. That cross, by the way, you see there in the image, is the biggest cross in the world till this day. And that was owned by the Franco government. And everybody is buried there from both sides. And a lot of the political prisoners were working in that valley. It's called the Valley of the Fallen, Valle de los Caídos. Okay, that's beautiful, beautiful. I think Estefania took those pictures. I'm not sure though, but this is just beautiful.
This is one of the promotional videos for the boys' choir.
So
this shows some great aerial footage of the. Let me make this bigger. Let's see here. So here's a great aerial footage of the monument built by Franco. Please continue.
So the both sides of the aisle, they're buried there in representation of, we're brothers and sisters, and Christ is what unites us. The war is over, but our brotherhood has never stopped being there. So Franco is buried there. Actually, was buried there behind an altar. Franco did not request to be buried there, by the way. That's what the church actually did for him. So when they buried him there by the altar, the monastery, everything supposedly was done. Spain actually, had prosperity at that time. Obviously, it wasn't perfect, but it was like the 9th most important industrial economy in the world at that time. Now it's far from that. So When the leftists took over again, especially in the last 10, 15 years, with Zapatero beginning with being the prime minister, which is a staunch socialist, he tried to push this agenda to desecrate the valley, the cemetery, the Valley of the Fallen, and he trying to just dig the bodies up, and Professor Bárcena, which is a very well-known professor in the Spanish world. He's been in the movie Garabandal, and he's an academic Spanish intellectual, arguably one of the most important and popular professors in the Hispanidad world, assures that it was part of the Masonic ritual. And he probably has good, evidence for it. I don't know for sure, but like I won't put it, I wouldn't doubt it. So the idea is Zapatero.
The exhuming of Franco was a
Yeah,
was a Masonic ritual, according to this professor.
yeah, Professor
They took
Bárcena,
out
and
Franco's
he actually.
body. Yeah.
Yeah, and he actually documented in books and research papers. He's actually one of the few people who have been there. There's thousands of documents, and he's one of those who actually read all those documents and did research, because there's this law in Spain, modern Spain. It's called Ley de Memoria Democrática, like a democratic memory law. So essentially, what it means with this law, they try to erase anything from Franco in Spain, anything religious. The valley wants to be turned, well, according to leftists, they want to turn it into just a public place, and they want to exhume all the bodies from the people buried there, and even punish anybody who speaks friendly of Franco to this day. I'm a little bit flabbergasted, Timothy, because I'm used to American freedoms, even with our flawed governments, even with our systems that sometimes don't perform the best way. At the end of the day, I'm surprised that you and I can use the medium like YouTube, and even if it's codified, we can openly speak our mind. Apparently, in Spain and Europe, it's not so. So you can actually get fined for praising Franco in some cases, and they're talking about a couple thousand euros there. So it's not cheap. They're really trying to do the whole like mind control or speech control over there. And a lot of the Spanish conservatives are finding refuge here in America because we have the ability to speak what they can't. This is where our nation, by the way, plays a crucial role, not just internally, but worldwide. This is the resistance, if you want to put it that way. The corner of the West, has been reduced to America, not even Canada, because we actually can speak for other countries that they are not allowed to be heard in that sense. So right now, with the modern prime minister, Pedro Sanchez, which is another avowed leftist socialist, I honestly don't know who is worse, Mexico's president or Spain's president. I mean, it's a tough battle, man. That tells you it's a race to the bottom. So Pedro Sanchez was the one who was able to exhume Franco's body in 2019 against the churches and the society's wishes. Even leftist wishes were like, we leave the dead alone kind of thing. But according to Professor Bárcena, and again, he has a lot of good evidence, he makes a strong case. It was actually a Masonic ritual. And if you see the videos, they kind of has a lot of those characteristics, but they were able to exhume his body, and it's a way to desecrate. But they haven't been content with, or they haven't been happy with that. They want to go further. This is an underlying lesson for us, by the way, here in America. If you think that left-leaning politicians or organizations are going to be happy with leaving you in your own corner of the country, you're gravely mistaken. Liberals go not just after you, after your possessions, and more importantly, after your children. They're not happy living their own wretched lives and ideologies. Let's say they can have whatever corner, not even the whole state. Let's say you give them part of California. They can do whatever you want, whatever they want. Well, that's not going to be enough. That's not going to suffice. It is no, I want to go to your place and I want to take over it and I want to indoctrinate your kids. And the reason why they haven't done it is not because they have nice, tender hearts. It's because they have not been able to. But the moment they're able to, trust me, they're coming after you. They're not going to come. They are already coming after you, and they're not going to stop until they're done with you.
Look what they did when they had power over the past 2 years. What did they do? They opened all the nastiest things in our society and closed down the churches. That's what they want to do when they have power.
And this is when we know we're in deep water, Timothy, because two things it's a common denominator with leftist governments. And I'm not a Republican per se. I'm for America. This is my country. I love it to death. But This is if you notice when you're in deep trouble is with governments. Here's two characteristics. Okay, the first one is inflation. See Venezuela. See what's going on in Bolivia. See what's going on in Argentina and Spain, all the parts of Europe. Inflation is one characteristic. The other one is violence. Like crime goes up. Anytime you have those, two factors going on, you have a socialist government in charge. Mexico is obviously the same thing, sadly, and we see it in parts of America too. This is obviously for us a wake-up call. But instead of acting like leftists, fighting fire with fire, the first step, and I said it with you many times before, is understanding, okay, what culture has successfully fought Marxists and socialists? The Spanish culture. What did they do? First and foremost, they cling to the dogmas of the church, okay? Which is not the same as saying to the clerics, which, I'm not sedevacantists at all. I'm not even Lefebvre's, to be honest. Like, and people know me on Twitter. I'm not necessarily a sympathizer for, like, all those who deny Vatican II and all that. I'm a staunch Vatican II supporter and all that. But I'm also not naive. I understand that there is great problems with our church government, not to undermine it or deny it, but there's clearly great troubles. So we don't cling per se to the figures, the political figures of our church. We cling to the dogmas, and that's what we need to follow through if we want to be successful and have a chance to overcome what's, trying to take over our nation.
Yeah, I want to pause for a minute and make sure everybody knows to check out Hispanidad, the whole series at 1 Peter 5. There's a link below the YouTube channel. And we have a wonderful Anglo writer from Canada who is a Hispanophile and goes to Mexico very often. And she writes these beautiful articles about Mexican Christendom, which I love. Her latest this morning is Our Lady of Pueblito Against Pagan Idols. And then we have the article, again, from Estefanía on the Franco's cross here. Leftist target Spain's relics and world record public cross. And we also talk a little bit about, obviously, the El Camino, Carlism in Texas. We have Luis's own article on Hispanic America. I love this Forgotten Catholic Founding of America. It's one of my favorite articles about Catholic Florida. And then so take a look at it. There's all our written content on Hispanidad so far. And if anyone wants to contribute to Hispanidad, this is all things Hispanic Christendom according to our editorial stance. And I think I should mention here, because as we're talking about Franco, what I've noticed in talking with you, Luis, and learning from you is that there is a complete dearth, lamentably, of an understanding and appreciation for Hispanic culture in the English language. And there's a reason for that, because the second enemy we mentioned, the Mohammedans were beaten back, and they obviously they hate Spain. But the other heretics, the Anglican regime, they were political rivals, religious rivals with the Spanish Empire. And they were also experts at propaganda. And they churned out their propaganda. They really invented the modern propaganda, I'd say, under the reign of the wicked Queen Elizabeth I. But so many of the black legends that you may have heard of, Spanish Inquisition, that was invented via Anglican propaganda. And to this day, I remember mentioning that I don't have where is that? I can't grab it right now, but Bartolome de las Casas.
Oh yeah.
He was propped up. He's been propped up by Anglican propaganda. And, the whole, even to this day, the whole Spanish colonialism black legend that, these Spanish people were so awful, even though all the Spaniards and the Aztecs married each other. I don't know why they were so awful. They married each other, but, but to this day, when I was in college, I was taught these black legends and Spanish black legends, but it's because there was an Anglican regime who made it their business to lie about Spain. And so there's just a total lack of English scholarship in the English language that's actually telling the truth about Spain. So this is why it's so important. And then once the Marxists get involved in the 20th century, it just gets even worse because as you said, their job is to put everything down the memory hole, to destroy the memory. And this also became acute for citizens of the United States, because what happened during the Spanish Civil War was you had the socialist Republicans, as you said, they're Marxists, they're communists. They're dragging out priests from their churches and shooting them in the street. They're throwing clergy to the lions. Literally, they went to the zoo and threw them to the lions to be eaten. This is a brutal, brutal civil war. You'll have to let me know if There Be Dragons is an accurate portrayal, but the brutality of the communists in this civil war was immense. So these were communists murdering and raping nuns and destroying Spaniards left and right throughout Spain. And guess who was on the side of that communist wicked takeover? The United States and Soviet Russia. They were both on the same side supporting the communists during this time. And so, and it just so happened that Franco was also on the wrong side, according to the Americans, in World War II. And we'll talk about that too. But all of this has to do with the fact that the American empire has had a vested interest in lying about Franco as well. Now, was Franco perfect? No. Obviously, Franco made mistakes. We can debate about that. That's fine. But Franco was a devout Catholic. He was a devout Catholic. He tell us about his Catholicism, Luis. Can you tell us any stories about Franco and his Catholicism?
Actually, Franco was such a devout Catholic that he named one of his own daughters Pilar, in honor of Our Lady of the Pillar and all that. He was a great promoter of Catholicism. He understood, hold on, this is an interesting fact about Franco that few people mention. It's documented. I can send you the links where you can source it if people are interested. When Franco was able to play both sides, because he understood he was stuck between a rock and hard place, right? You have the Nazis on one side and then the communists on the other side. That's a tough neighborhood, honestly. Hitler actually visited Franco quite a bit and all that. Hitler actually ended up hating Franco because he felt played by Franco, which was true at the end of the day. And even the Germans said it. The Spanish don't understand fascism as we understand it. They're like in a disappointed kind of frame view. So Franco also, this is an interesting law. When Primo de Rivera, the general, early 20th century, was in power, he enacted, or his administration or the monarch enacted a law that allowed the former Sephardic Jews to come back to Spain. Remember, we talked about the expulsion of the Jews, one of the earliest cities of Catholicism, how France and England and all these places kicked the Jews out of their countries, and they were really mean. And when Spain finally they said, okay, we have to do this, they actually even sent them with resources and allow them safe passages and all that, which is very different from all the European countries. And it's not because the Spanish in and of themselves, with all due respect, they're virtuous. They're just humans, like sinners like you and I. It's because Catholicism really had a strong imprint in the way they handle things. In Catholicism is every human bears the image of God, imago Dei, right? And even if you don't agree with that person, even if that person is wrong, he still bears God's image and deserves by in and of itself degree of dignity, period. Well, the Jews were allowed to come back. And Franco used that law, even though explicitly Spain only recognized Catholicism. It's not the official religion of Spain, but they recognize this is the religion of the Spanish people. Well, they said, anyone who has Spanish descendants, even if he was not Catholic, can come to Spain or find safe passage to Spain. So the Spanish ambassadors, especially in France, but especially in Germany, were literally smuggling Jews running from Poland, from Germany, and all these other places that were being persecuted, and found safe passage in Spain. Literally, Spain sent ambassadors all the way to Greece to snug some Jews running from persecution. And guess what? They sailed from Spain, and even to a lesser degree, Portugal, to go to America in Mexico and Argentina, primarily, to find safe passage. And it was through Spain. Literally, the Jews in Israel and some universities celebrate Franco's birth till this day in honor to all the things that Franco did. So a lot of people are baffled because how can this right-wing Catholic, there's such a staunch Catholic and, Catholicism everywhere in Spain and crucifixes in all the public schools and prayer and blah, 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 be so benevolent to a religion like Judaism. And this is where one of the greatest mistakes all these academics make is to connect Catholicism with anti-Judaism, which is different from anti-Semitism. For those of you who are watching, they're two different terms, by the way. Well, Obviously, Catholicism is not strictly speaking, Judaism. We have, strictly speaking, nothing against them. We just wish for them to find the fullness of the faith, which is Catholicism, which is true, find Christ. That's it. But it's not necessarily we want to eradicate anybody, at least. And I think most of them understand it that way. Well, Franco understood it that way. And even though it was a different ideology per se, or different understanding of life, he still provided safe passages for thousands of Jews actually to be saved. Till this day, they're very thankful for. And it was not done anywhere else in Europe. It was like, once again, Spain, and thanks to the Catholicism of Franco.
Yeah, that's a great story. That I didn't even know that story. But we've at this point we've said pretty much all the buzzwords to get the YouTube shut us down. We'll see if this YouTube video even continues on YouTube. I don't know. Last time I talked about this topic, it was removed from YouTube within 48 hours. So we'll just see. Yeah, it's funny. What about can you talk on Franco's relationship with the so-called the mustache man who was in Germany at the time of World War II?
Well, little mustache man went to Spain and got a lot of gold and a lot of resources, and Franco got a lot of weapons and strategic, actually used a lot of the German intelligence and strategic to win the Civil War. Once the war was done, actually, and over with, there is a clear distancing. Now, before we get all like before we tear our clothes with indignity, we do the same thing in America. Well, we don't, but like our government does sort of the same thing. We flirt with both sides, and then we pick the winner kind of thing. In America, they kind of the same thing. Once Franco won, they recognize him as, okay, this is the guy that rules Spain, and we're gonna go with it, whether we like it or not. Well, the short man with a stash up there in the northern lands of Europe obviously felt played and defrauded, and he vowed actually to hang Franco as soon as the war was over, and hang it from the tallest pole if he can find it, because that's how much disdain he had for him. Obviously, that didn't come, and thankfully also that didn't happen. But there was not necessarily a very friendly relationship they had. At the end of the day, the ones who actually hated the most, even more than that guy with a stash, was actually the Soviets. They really resented the fact that they lost. Spain became for a little bit a laboratory, there for warfare. They tested, both sides tested a lot of weapons, both sides, tested strategies, and both sides took notes of what was going on for the sadly bigger theater, which is World War II. That's where we're at. And by the way, the church named Franco the defender of the faith also.
Oh, there we go. Yes, very, very important. Yes. He's a defensor fidei, a very important title that the Pope gives you, that you don't get lightly. So, as I understand it, we talk about Our Lady of Fatima, and Our Lady of Fatima warns that these errors of Russia will spread. And in Western Europe and the Americas, the Soviets were already spreading they were spreading sexual revolution. But as I understand it, the Soviets were sending all these resources into Spain to try to instigate the Spanish Civil War, and they had been doing that. Can you speak to that, the Soviets' involvement?
Yeah, that's actually how this whole radicalization. Let me put it in modern terms, actually, so we can relate. You know how the Soviets go to Spain and they start like infiltrating to universities and mainstream media and propaganda, and they start literally funding. Russia started funding all these places to, like you mentioned, to instigate civil war. The society that reacts against it, and culturally speaking, Jose Primo de Rivera is the one who was kind of able to gather all this like sentiment of repulsion to the socialist idea. I'm not saying what he did is great or perfect. I'm just saying what happened. In modern terms, will be kind of like, you have the Spanish society was started by the way of politicians when supposedly both sides of the aisle working basically the same agenda. Very similar to what happened in America, what happened a few years back, where Steve Bannon per se was able to kind of conceptualize the concept of former 45, former president. I don't want to name him because we already mentioned all these buzzwords. I don't want more.
So thank you.
Yeah. So Yeah, he was a political. I mean, he was 45 was the political figure, but really the soul behind it was more like Steve Bannon per se. Well, that was Primo de Rivera in that regard, right? And the people found refuge. Okay, this guy gets it, because this is not about being Republican or Democrat here in America. They were tired of rhinos. Well, the same thing in Spain was happening. They were tired of supposedly right-wing conservatives just playing along with the Republicans, who were clearly being instigated by the Russians in that sense. Obviously, this is way after our later Fatima, the event. Till this day, we can see the consequences of the errors of Russia. Till this day, in our country, by the way, not just like in Europe, in all Hispanic America, except for all Latin America, actually, except for Brazil, it is actually left-leaning socialist, governments. Chile, Argentina, except for maybe Paraguay and Uruguay, which Uruguay is fairly liberal anyway, culturally speaking. Everybody, it's like Colombia, which the unthinkable happened. We have a Marxist now in power, self-declared Marxist, where Colombia has never happened. So we have, with all the respect, Colombia is one thing. It's a smaller country. It's bad. But when Mexico goes socialist, that's concerning. That's the biggest Spanish-speaking country in the whole world. The third biggest Catholic body in the world too. So that's our major thing. So anyway, so we see all this leftism spreading in America till this day from the eras of Russia. Well, this is what's happening already in Spain, and Spain sought to, through the phalanx, through the political party, to push back kind of like what the MAGA movement. It's not exactly the same, just it's for us to have an idea. Movement sought to stop like the drain the swamp kind of attitude thing, So this is for us to have a parallel understanding of what was going on in society. Like there's nothing new under the sun at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good parallel, because there are right wingers in the United States that Catholics may find to, I mean, the president you mentioned, first and foremost, I mean, that president, we're not sure how pious he really is or was, and many of his supporters were, of course, but Catholics are willing to ally with the sort of a broad alliance of conservatism for just practical purposes. We don't like all the opinions of everybody and what if they want to do. They're not pious, they're just right wingers, but we're willing to have some collaboration with them. I think that's a good parallel with the situation with the Spanish Civil War. I want to ask you about post-Vatican II Spain, because as I understand it, according to Anglo scholar of Franco, Stanley Payne, David Wemhoff's book talks about this and other sources. As I understand it, after Vatican II, Paul VI, who was arguably a little naive about the communists, he was pressuring Franco to renounce the I think it was the rights of the Spanish crown to confirm bishops, something like that, where the secular power had the right to cooperate in the appointment of bishops. And this is very traditional. This goes back centuries and centuries and centuries, that secular, the so-called secular, meaning the temporal lay power of rulers, was confirming and cooperating to a degree. The emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, could actually veto the Pope, for example, as he did in the 1903 or 4 conclave. So as I understand it, Paul VI pressured Franco to renounce this, which, as I understand it, he did, to obey the Pope because he was trying to be a pious Catholic, and also allow more freedom of religion to the non-Catholics in Spain, specifically the Protestants. And as a result of this, at least the argument goes, there was a lot of Marxist-friendly bishops, but definitely Marxist clergy who actually led the post-Vatican II Marxism in Spain. It was led by clergy, according to Stanley Payne and David Wemhoff. So how do you interpret the post-Vatican II Spanish history?
You just hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's exactly what happened, at least in my estimation. The first wave of Marxism came through the educational system. That's a warning shot for us. The second one came actually through the clergy in Spain after the 60s. And it's no coincidence that after Vatican II, and again, I'm very careful the way I try to phrase this, because I don't want to give the impression, I really reject and abhor the idea, the notion that Vatican II is the reason why we have fallout in the church and all this debacle, because I think it's a very reductionist, very simplistic argument, with all due respect for those who don't subscribe to that. Because Protestants also have seen all the backbone of their faith, Jews and Mohammedans too. I mean, it's not exclusively of Catholics. It's just more noticeable on us, obviously, because we're a bigger target anyway. But it actually, I just ask and plead to, like, let's expand this view a little bit more. Let's question it deeper. What happened, at least in the Western world, and I'm sure in the Eastern world have had their own issues, during the 60s. What is it that made us as a whole society exchange the transcendental view, something bigger than ourselves, exchange it for some materialistic view? I don't understand. It's a mystery to me. But obviously, to reduce it to Vatican II, to me, is kind of silly, with all due respect.
Yeah,
well,
and I just want to say to that point, I think that trads, we should be able to concede the fact that there are a multitude of historical factors influencing this whole decline. Vatican I is one of the factors, and different things that happened at Vatican II or whatever. There's all sorts of different factors at play historically.
Yeah.
So I don't think I agree
it's
with you.
more complex.
We should reduce it to only one cause. That would be a little naive to look at it only one cause as to counsel.
Yeah, it's like saying, well, dental, and again, I love going to Latin Mass, and I love going to ordinary, all this traditional stuff. Like, I love it. Actually, all my sacramentals basically have been blessed in Tridentine masses, like, so I go there, not because I think this better or anything. I love it. So I'm putting my money where my mouth is, in other words. Well, it's kind of infantile to say just because you change it from the to Latin to the vernacular, everything went apart. Well, it's just not so. In this particular case, back to the original point with Spain, I just don't understand how is it that Franco went from being a defender of the faith, and then after Vatican II, and I'll specify what my stance in Vatican II is, it's the opposite. Like, it was an antagonistic relationship. And also the priests now are doing the function that the teachers did, 60 years earlier than, before them, 50, 60 years before them. And now Marxism is infiltrating through the priesthood in the communities. And it was actually the priests who were leading the reforms in Spain, the liberal reforms in the 70s, that once Franco passed out and all that, took hold of Spain. There's a constant theme of conflict in the Spanish society with liberals trying to change society in Spain. For example, early in the 20th century, when the Republicans funded by the Marxists, like we mentioned before, were trying to get hold of it, the king was Alfonso XIII, El Rey Alfonso. And King Alfonso, by the way, was the guy who consecrated Spain to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Spain has been consecrated like 3 times. He was the last one. And an ironic point is King Alfonso ended up consecrating Spain, but he ended up self-exiled, sure, but he ended up being exiled from Spain, because then when the Republicans took over, his head was on the line. He said, well, I gotta go before this, broils into a bigger conflict. But anyway, with King Alfonso, this is documented, actually. You have the Masonic lodges there who were pushing for King Alfonso to legalize divorce, to make it okay to be divorced, and diversity of religion and all that kind of stuff. And King Alfonso refused. And when King Alfonso was going to consecrate Spain, they warned him, you may consecrate Spain, but you will not stay in the kingdom. And obviously they meant business, because he consecrated Spain, but he had to run for his life. So
what year was that consecration?
1919, if I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the dates. The consecration of the Sacred Heart of Jesus of Spain. Needless to say, King Alfonso was not necessarily a pious man. Okay, that let's just clarify that. I'm not trying to lionize him or anything like that. So when that happened, not too long after it, he had to run, run for his life, and the monarchy was done not too long after him. Well, you have this constant tension between, Marxists trying to change society. And one of the key themes that Marxists want to do, like I mentioned before, is the first thing is we got to get rid of any concept of transcendental. Same thing you see in America. Is one of the first things the liberal ones is we want to make sure they understand that there's nothing bigger than ourselves. We're it. In this case, for us, it's technocrats more than actually, Marxists. But it's the same thing. Technocrats nowadays, most of them are working for the Marxist agenda. All this. So this just ends up in the same place. Well, now when Franco, the second part of the legacy after Vatican II, the relationship with the church was definitely sour, not as good. And part of it was because a lot of priesthood, I don't want to say everybody or even most, but a big chunk of the priesthood and the clergy in Spain became highly, highly liberalized and introduced Marxism. The Jesuits obviously being at the front line of this in Spain, among other places. The area of the Basque country also, my people, I come from Basque stock, we became also very liberal, the clergy over there. But also, this is the time we have Our Lady of Garabandal, which I know is not necessarily an approved apparition, but also warning about those things in Garabandal. The apparitions of Our Lady there, warning about this thing going on and prophecy and whatnot.
Yeah, I just wanted to I look up the final words of Franco, or his final public address is in November 1975. He exhorted his fellow Spaniards. This is quoting from David Wemhoff's book, by the way, about CIA involvement in Vatican II. Franco says this, quote, "When the hour comes for me to surrender my life before the Most High and appear before his implacable judgment, I pray that God may receive me graciously in his presence, for I sought always to live and die as a Catholic. Do not forget that the enemies of Spain and of Christian civilization are alert." End quote.
That's a great lesson for us till this day, by the way. Do not forget that the enemies, now it's not so much Spain, but America and Christendom, they're alert, and we're not. And this is part of Reconquista, it's a wake-up call, and also my collaboration with you, Timothy, and other people is really a wake-up call, not for fear actually, but to take up arms in this case, not necessarily little like weapons, but like the rosary, which I know is being categorized as whatever, but like sacramentals and prayer and devotion and piousness, because this is how we overcome the enemies of the faith nowadays. Timothy, have way more money and resources than us. They have all the media, they have academia, they have the government agencies, clearly. So we're not gonna overpower them. It's like trying to get in a kicking contest with a mule. You're not gonna win. Well, but they lack the most important thing, faith in our Lord. And they don't have the advocate of Our Lady. They don't have a lawyer like Our Lady. And I'm sorry, but if you're gonna lawyer up, you better have Our Lady on your side, because you're gonna lose. So this is the opportunity for us to rise up and become what we're called to be: values, courageous Christian men. Franco understood this in their society. We can apply in our society, especially with Generation X and younger, like millennials and Gen Z. Is, I'm sorry, but you're born in a spiritual war right now. That's just the way it is. Not your fault, but that's just a reality, okay? And there's sides to be taken. In this spiritual war we have, especially fathers like you and me, we're generals, and the supreme commander is Christ. We have to give answers to Christ. And our soldiers are our family, our children. How are we going to train our children to fight a spiritual war that's going on right now? By hiding our heads and burying them in the sand, or we're going to embrace our Catholic faith in ways that has been proven to be successful, like Spain, and apply it in our lives, in our communities.
Absolutely. So that brings up the movement that we are promoting at 1 Peter 5 is the Crusade of Eucharistic Reparation. Mm-hmm. And this is really modeled after the Reconquista, the successful crusade. We have a number of different articles along these lines, but just so everyone knows, you can join the crusade. We haven't set up everything yet on the website, but you can email me if you want to join, editor@1peter5.com. And this involves making reparation to our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament for so many different injuries given to him, and restoring the Latin Mass in the church. And it just involves a 1-hour adoration per month, and then praying once per month the prayer of the Crusade, written by His Excellency Bishop Athanasius Snyder. And we have a number of other devotions that we recommend. But what Spain gives us this model for crusade, because we have other crusades in the history of the church, most famously the Eastern Crusade, which went to Jerusalem. And the first crusade was a success. It took back Jerusalem for Christendom. But if you study that history closely, you can see, why did the Eastern Crusade ultimately fail? The reason is because the Crusaders were too attached to earthly concerns. Their crusade was not purified of all earthly attachments. They started to bicker over power and riches and all this, and they started to fight for an earthly kingdom instead of the heavenly kingdom, the city of God. And that's why they failed, because nothing will ever stand against Mohammedanism unless you are perfectly purified in your soul. If you try to fight with the earthly sword against Muhammad, Muhammad will beat you. But if you fight against Muhammad with the spiritual sword, as Spain did, because we have the whole history of the El Camino de Compostela, all of Europe was doing pilgrimages to Spain for centuries and centuries. The greatest, I think, is number 3 pilgrimage site, or number 2 maybe in Europe, because they didn't go to Jerusalem very often. But you had Rome, number 1. Walsingham is up there too, but Compostela is one of the greatest pilgrimages sites of all time. And we had pilgrims going there for centuries. And we have this purification of the Western Crusade in Spain, because we can see that it was a much more deeply rooted in the people, and they were not saying they didn't sin. We had Spanish kings killing each other, and it was the I can't remember the name of the traitor who let the Mohammedans in 7.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Yeah, it was actually a former cleric, a bishop, actually, who defected. Yes.
Oh yeah, never mind. I love the speech of the bishop who tries to convince Pelayo to give up the Reconquista, and he says that you'll never win. He says, so just so we should tell the story real quick, because it's so important. I mean, the all of Spain is conquered by the Mohammedans. This is like the year 750, 711 or something.
Yeah, 711, I think, yeah.
The entire country had been fallen to the Mohammedans at that point. And there was just a little mountain called Asturias, or the mountain, or the region Asturias. Yeah. And the bishop comes to him and says, "You got to give up. You're not going to win. What are you thinking, Pelayo? Just give up to the Mohammedans." The bishop's talking to the prince, and Pelayo says, "No, have you not read that the church is the mustard seed?" And that's the beginning of the Reconquista. What did I miss in that beautiful story?
Well, and also you got to keep on. Let's go back a couple of centuries. Spain was one of the early places where actually, because the Arian controversy, you have Arian Christianity and then Trinitarian Christianity. Well, Spain settled that question early on to Toledo Council and all those things. So because you have the monarchs in Spain were mostly German descent, barbarian descent, or Arian in Spain. But the Hispanic, like the Romans descendants and the Phoenician descendants, so the people who make up Hispania were actually Trinitarian, and that was causing tensions. Well, finally, Spain settles that question, and they become a Trinitarian kingdom. Everybody's just on the same page. Well, a couple centuries later, next thing you know, the Islam is invading, and that's what's happening. So Spain already had this idea of, we're fighting against something bigger than ourselves, and we have to cling to the dogmas of the faith. That's actually one of the underlying tones of Hispanic thought. Again, it's not about race, it's not about language, it's about understanding what matters in life, and what matters is the faith. In Spain, part of the reason why, let me go forward a little bit with the Protestant revolt and all that. The reason why it did, first of all, culturally speaking, Spanish is Catholic. But other than that, in the Catholic DNA of the Spanish society or the Hispanic society, but at least in Spain particularly, they had a formidable enemy, which is Islam. And they really had to pick sides clearly. There was no necessarily middle ground or compromises. It's either you're Catholic or you're going to be erased, and your family's going to be sold into slavery, because the institution of slavery was highly profitable for the Islamic world. That's another, politically incorrect fact that I don't want to talk about, but actually was the Muslims who actually benefit a lot from human trafficking, especially with white European women. Well, anyway, back to the Pelayo story. So Spain already had in their DNA the whole question about who are we? What are we going to choose? And when Islam was at the doors knocking there, they said, no, basically they're saying, we don't have the weapons in the system, but somehow God will provide. Deus vult. And Our Lady appeared in this cave in Covadonga, which is northern Spain, in Asturias. And the rest is history. It's just...
my Covadonga right here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Right yeah, you can't see it because my face is in the way usually, but...
And that's literally what has defined Spain. That key moment, really, like rejecting a heretic bishop, has defined not just Spain, but really Hispanicity and the Western world in a greater extent. That key moment, who knew that a prince on the run hiding in a cave was going to be a defining moment for the Western world. That's just like small changes can have bigger impacts. So for us in America, because we're right now the only country, sadly, that is resistant to the combats and the attacks of the global elite. We're seeing some positive changes. The former president of this country, right, number 45, did something very interesting. His personal character, is obviously questionable. That's a reality. We mentioned that before. I mean, nothing personal, but it clearly is more than questionable. Okay, I get you that. But Timothy, one of the things I noticed is, I don't know if you remember in his campaign farewell address before the re-election campaign started, they play the Ave Maria at the White House by a Protestant president, and a president who has a lot of moral flaws, by the way. So I thought, hold on a second, Our Lady, if you would have told me you're going to witness the Ave Maria at the White House in a political event by this flawed character, this is not about him, by the way, it's about Our Lady. It's like, that's actually a lot of reasons to be hopeful for. While the other side, I remember that, what was the song? What is Worth For? I forgot. They did a remix, and this guy acting in a very questionable manner, dancing with a dress and all that. Anyway, so you see two different images, conflicting, two different messages. For us, this is our turn, and we cling to Our Lady for guidance and through the power of God. And this is the key point. And I'm going to go to the questions very quickly if you let me finish this point, which is, I don't know if you read The Art of War, from Sun Tzu. One of the things he mentions is the highest form of war is attacking strategy, okay? And then the second lowest form of war is attacking resources, people. And then the lowest form is attacking people. And I'm paraphrasing, by the way. But I know this, like the highest form of war is attacking strategy because you win without firing a shot. Adoration, by the way, is a strategic, battle. So if you go to adoration, or if you go to confession, if you partake in the sacraments of the church, strategically speaking, you're actually given a great, you're hitting the enemy where they can't see it, but they will feel it. This is why we focus on that and not necessarily on the other things. The other things will come in and of themselves eventually, but if we don't part from the beginning, which is the strategy, and our strategy is we're going to partake in the sacraments, this is why the enemy wants to disrupt our family life and our spiritual lives, because the enemy knows that if they can break our strategic habits, spiritual habits, the rest will work on its own.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The real battle is against the fallen angels, against the world of flesh and devil. If we lose sight of that and start to fight like the world, as you said, fighting fire with fire, like if we fight like a Marxist, if we succumb to speaking words against charity on the internet, on social media, and succumb to sins like this, we're just going to be destroyed by the fallen angels. It's simple as that. Pater Familia says, what is the best book on the Reconquista?
There's a great book by Jose Javier Esparza that is called Asturias. There's many great books, but that's probably personally my favorite. I don't know if it's in English. I'm not sure. I got to check. It's a popular book, so I would be surprised if it is in English.
What's
I will
the last
research.
Name?
Esparza, Asturias is the name of the book, and it has the story of how the Visigoths came from Spain, and the Moors, coming to Spain, and it's really cool.
La Gran Inventura de Reino de Asturias, that one?
Yeah. Okay. It has the image of a king, like a bearded king and all that.
Yeah, it looks like I don't see an English version.
We'll see. And if not, I'll look for it. There's different books that talk about the Reconquista in English as well, translations. This is one of the things we got to work on in the Hispanic world, especially the Hispanic in the U.S., translating. There's a lot of great documents in Spain that we can use in English. And the beautiful thing is, in order for us to apply these principles, we don't have to be Spanish or Hispanic or whatever it is. This is our lessons for all of us. Just like Guadalupe, Our Lady of Guadalupe is for all of us. This thing from Spain is for all of us here in America. And this is the place that is needed the most in our country, because this is the crux of the spiritual battle in this nation.
Yeah, I want to note one of the most important factors of Spanish Christendom, the Spanish Empire, that distinguishes it very sharply from the French Christendom after the Council of Trent, where France really experienced a great decline in their own Catholic society because there was absolute monarchy that was centralizing more and more and more bureaucracy and taking over local towns and bringing all the local lords to Versailles instead of ruling their own local place. And that is subsidiarity, this critical principle of Catholic social teaching, wherein the local government must be the primary governor of the local concerns, and it should not be handled by a centralized bureaucracy. And that's something that obviously the United States has a serious problem with for the past 150 years or so. But even more and more, even in this the past 2 years crisis of that thing that we know what we're talking about 2 years ago, in 2020, and how we've had more and more and more centralization. And this Our Lady of Guadalupe brings, as you noted, Nahuatl, and how the Hispanic Empire was obviously used Latin for theology and liturgy and etc. But Spanish was used for politics, economics, and various things. But the local people would have been speaking various tongues, local tongues, the local dialects that all these Spanish missionaries put into writing for the first time. They studied the grammar, and they helped these people preserve their language, contrary to the Marxist myths that are propagated. Not only Nahuatl, but the dialects of the Andes Empire, the Mayan Empire, the dialects in the Philippines. And this is something that Our Lady of Guadalupe really shows us is really it's sort of a subsidiarity of Christendom in the spiritual sense, because she perfectly makes true enculturation, which is where she presents herself as a mestiza who is this image communicates to a common Aztec like Juan Diego, common Indian of the time. It perfectly communicates the whole gospel message in a perfectly enculturated form in Nahuatl. So
And
go ahead.
No, it's one of the greatest things about our faith is, Timothy, if you notice, one of the distinctives of Catholicism, it actually doesn't eradicate cultures, it sanctifies them. So, in other words, it's not out there to eliminate and replace like we saw in Canada or in America and other places where, like, if you're an Indian, you were pretty much pushed to a reservation. Till this day, we have them here in Oklahoma and parts of the U.S. Or you cease to be Indian and become just culturally anglicized, or whatever you want to call it. But in other words, it eradicates your culture. This is why Catholicism is the only one who has able to go to places like Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia and have an impact without erasing the cultural heritage. And we don't take those extremes. We get rid of the bad, obviously. We sanctify the good, and life moves on. It's not like you don't. Juan Diego didn't cease to be indigenous, but he was Catholic and very devout. And the Spaniards did not become indigenous. Nobody's going to pretend that. But they obviously learn a lot from each other. Literally, the descendants of Montezuma are living till this day in Spain. Actually, they're great advocates for Hispanidad. Also, by the way, they were one of the persons objecting Mexico's president's request for Spain to apologize for the conquest. So how does that play out? Very simple. They were actually Indian nobility, from the Incas or the Aztecs, who were actually teaching at the Spanish university, in Oviedo or Salamanca or whatever. Like, that tells you why Catholic spirit is important in this sense. It is no surprise that other faiths struggle converting, because the only option is uniformity, where Catholicism is universal. And there's a distinction, I mentioned that before with you. Universal, balance things. Uniformity requires force, and somebody's going to lose in this sense with uniformity. Everyone has to be the same. In Catholicism, it is not uniformal, it's universal. And that's, since literally the word actually is in the word. So this is the distinctive. It's the only society, not even the Portuguese were able to manage this. I don't understand why. Obviously, the French were not able to do that, neither the English or the Dutch. Clearly, the Dutch, and worst of all, the Belgians. We know what the atrocities did in Africa. They're probably the worst of all in that sense. Now, it's in the past. It's not our fault, and in that regard, we move on. But this is a clear example why, when the dogmas of the faith which don't belong to Spain, by the way, belongs to the church, are applied correctly in our society, great things can happen. America is primed for those things to happen, and I actually have a almost certainty that it will happen in my generation, and I'm very excited to see what it's going to look like.
Fantastic. Well, that's a perfect way to end this. Thank you very much for your comments, everyone in the chat. Luis, thank you so much. I always enjoy talking about Hispanidad with you, as you know, so I appreciate it. So stay tuned in a couple weeks where we will have somewhat of a similar episode about French Christendom, obviously occasioned by the Holy Father's visit to Canada, in which there was an apology to a degree. And you just mentioned how the Mexican president demanded an apology from Spain in sort of a similar vein, but the Indian descendant of the Aztecs living in Spain rebuked him for it, which is hilarious. But so yeah, we'll get that up. That'll be with Charles Coloma and Kennedy Hall, two French Canadians, Anglo Canadians, Italian,
my favorites.
So we'll get into that in a couple of weeks. But for now, let's offer up an Ave Maria that our crusade may be purified through the intercession of Our Lady of Guadalupe, Empress of the Americas. Let's pray. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.